So now let's talk about autism. And autism is probably the newest of the disabilities that we see in the school setting because really the national conversation on autism began in the late 1980s when the film Rain Man was released. And so I remember going to see Rain Man as a junior high student, seeing it at a theater when I was growing up. And so that movie is something that I've kind of lived with through a big chunk of my life. But before Rain Man, we didn't really have a conversation about autism. One aside, the screenwriter for the film Rain Man is a man called Barry Morrow. And Barry Morrow was also the screenwriter for two made for TV movies that were produced in the late 70s and the early 80s called Bill. There's a great documentary. It's called A Friend Indeed, the Bill Sachter Story. I'll create a link below for that as well. You can watch it free on YouTube. The whole video is on YouTube, and I think it's on some other streaming platforms. But it's the story of a man who was institutionalized when he was 7, and then 44 years later came out of the institution. And his success as a person was really due to the work of Barry Morrow and his wife. They just befriended this man. And they started in Minnesota, and when they moved to Iowa City so he could take a job at the University of Iowa, Bill eventually came with them. And they just really helped Bill establish a life for himself. And as a part of that, Morrow writes these two movies about Bill and then goes on to Hollywood to write Rain Man. And so Barry Morrow holds a really special place in my heart because he's responsible for a lot of what we call normalization, helping society see that people with disabilities are normal members of society just like the rest of us, that a disease that we might have or a limitation that we might have doesn't make us any less people. Bill and the Kim Peek is the man that inspired the film Rain Man. Those people were just as fully human as the rest of us. And so I always like to talk about Barry Morrow because I don't think he gets the credit for what he's actually done. And so with Rain Man, then we begin to talk about autism. And Kim Peek, the man who inspired the film Rain Man, when he was young, he was referred to as an idiot savant. That was the clinical term because he had this savant, this extra ability in his ability to remember things, but not the capability to apply things. We see this in a scene in the film Rain Man where Tom Cruise's character Charlie Babbitt has taken Raymond or Rain Man to the doctor, and the doctor's asking him questions, and he can do big multiplication problems in his head and tell you what day of the week October 8th was in 1786, but doesn't know how much it costs to buy a candy bar or a car. Kim Peek was an interesting man. You used to be able to find a lot of videos about him on YouTube, but Stanford University owned those, and I think they've been taken off now. But when Kim Peek, his favorite place, he lived in Salt Lake City, Utah, and his favorite place was the library. And he would go to the library and read several books a day. And he was able to read. So imagine if we open a book and we're able to read the left page with our left eye while simultaneously reading the right page with our right eye and having about 97% comprehension, right? That just blows us away. What would life be like, especially as students, if we could read all of our books in half the time and maybe comprehend them a little better than we do reading one page at a time? And so that's just kind of a fascinating thing about him. They called him the human encyclopedia because he'd read all those books. He never forgot anything. And then he could do these great calculations in his mind. And so that was called an idiot savant, someone who wasn't able to apply information, but had this great capacity. And as time goes on, our conception of autism has changed. And so today when we look at autism, we say ASD, or autism spectrum disorders. And there's about 16 diagnoses that fall under that spectrum. One is classic autism. We would call Kim Peek a savant today. Rett syndrome, Fragile X syndrome, Asperger's. We still use Asperger's in the schools, even though the psychological community as delisted Asperger's from the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. But all these conditions. And the joke I like to tell is if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. We don't have a great ability to generalize the characteristics of people with autism. And so it's really important that we get to know each one of them as individuals and come to understand who they are. Now, having said that, there are some generalizations. We think about people on the autism spectrum as perhaps having a hard time communicating, and perhaps not loving social interactions in the same way that everybody else does. And we know that some people with Asperger's can really become fascinated with one topic and really dig deeply into that topic. I'll put a list of resources, probably more for this section than any of the others. There's a movie called Autism the Musical that really looks at autism and the parents' perspective of autism, which I think is really valuable. There's lots of books now that have been written by people with autism that help us understand autism. And so there's, it's a new thing. There's lots of conversations going on about it. Some people consider autism to be an epidemic, that it's becoming more and more common in diagnoses. And I'm not really on board with somehow there's more people with autism in the population today than there have been in the past. My feeling is that in the past, we identified someone as having a disability and then we institutionalized them, so we didn't actually get to what their disability is. There was a man in a neighborhood where I lived in Kansas City for a time, and he was just kind of a neighborhood character, and he befriended me and I befriended him. He befriended everybody in the neighborhood. I mean, is really how that went. He would stop by the place where my kids had in-home daycare twice a day, conveniently during snack time. He'd do part of the route with the mailman, and once in a while the guys on the trash truck would allow him to ride along on the back of the trash truck. It was just this guy. I still have my students write to him every year. I just in the mail this week got a letter from him he's got a new address, and he doesn't live in the neighborhood anymore. I think he lives in a supported community now, so it's good to still be in touch with him. I was at a barbecue. The woman that ran the in-home daycare had a barbecue every summer, and so I was there, and this man's dad was there. And I said to him, it's really none of my business, and I don't really like to ask this, but my field is special education, and I've really gotten to know or enjoy knowing your son. And the son was older than I am. And I said, I'd really like to know about his schooling. And the dad said, well, they let him go to school until he was in the 6th grade, but they said he had a mental retardation, and so after the 6th grade he couldn't come to school anymore. This was before special ed law. Now, I stood there and I didn't say anything to this man because I didn't feel like it was my place. I would bet every penny in my pocket right now, which really is about $1.50, so not a great bet. That man did not have an intellectual disability. He was on the autism spectrum, but simply when he was coming up through school, we didn't have that language. We didn't know that was the diagnosis. And so I have a hunch, and I can't prove it, I don't know for sure, but I have a hunch that we're just diagnosing more people because our diagnostic criteria has become more refined. And there's probably a lot of people who, I sort of think back to myself in school or other kids that I was in school with, who were called book smart, not street smart. I assume that was more prevalent than just the little school that I went to. And I often, when I interact with students with Asperger's today, I wonder if they were today's version of book smart, not street smart. And so my sense is that we've simply created a finer capability in our diagnosis, and that autism really isn't an epidemic. Autism is what we might call the designer disability. There's a man called Colin Ong Dean, and his book is Distinguishing Disability. And he looks at disability from the perspective of members of our community with cultural capital. Usually research focuses in special ed on people that have a hard time accessing services. And he says throughout the history of special education, there have been some disabilities that parents have advocated for in favor of others, or in favor of others, yeah. And so that autism is the one today that people are advocating for, because it is in the media. We are talking about it. It is something that's more accepted and has less stigma than some of the other disability categories that we've talked about. For a long time, it was thought that ABA therapy, or applied behavioral analysis therapy, was the only thing that would really work for students with autism. But I think what we know today is that students with autism can be included in classrooms. We have to get to know them a little better. These are students, again, like the last few segments, that partnerships with the public schools might be a necessity, because there are some specialized services and some specialized teachers who can help students with autism. So I think there's some people with autism that can be included in Catholic schools with very, very little support. And there's some students who may need a lot more support. So like with everything in special education, it's an individual by individual decision. I referenced in an earlier segment the book that I always recommend if you're more interested in autism is a book called Neural Tribes. We'll have a link to that below. I would urge you to check that out if this is an area that you're interested in. So that's been our consideration of autism.